Every birthday candle I ever blew out was followed by silence, except the year I lit my own cupcake at 13. That year, Mom had a cold, and Dad had a conference call. Rachel had a gymnastics showcase, even though she was only 7 and barely remembered the routine. I remember because I'd made my own card. I folded the construction paper neatly, wrote, "Happy birthday, Leah," in my best cursive, and placed it on the table like it was from someone who cared. I stuck a candle in the middle of a Hostess cupcake and struck a match with hands that had finally stopped trembling. I blew it out in one breath, not for luck, just to keep the flame from spreading. Years later, I still remember the color of the cupcake wrapper, red foil. I kept it for months in my journal, pressed flat behind a to-do list. It was the only proof that someone had remembered, even if that someone was me. Growing up in Hickory Falls meant our town's Harvest Festival was the big event every year. Hay rides, apple cider, homemade crafts, the works. It also meant Rachel got to be the pumpkin queen twice before she hit middle school. Her face was on posters at the local diner, grinning between corn stalks and scarecrows. Everyone adored her. She had that spark, bright, giggly, good at posing. I used to joke that she had her own fan club, but it wasn't really a joke. I was just the older sister who watched. At the festival when I was 12, I won first place in a poetry contest. I remember carrying the certificate in both hands, waiting for my parents to notice. They were busy taking photos of Rachel near the pie stand, where she was pretending to sell slices for her Girl Scout troop. I waited 20 minutes before I tucked the certificate into my backpack and walked home. No one asked why I left early. I tried not to keep score. I really did. But some memories have a way of tallying themselves. In 8th grade, I made an honor roll every semester. My parents congratulated me with a polite smile and a reminder to help Rachel study for her math quiz. The same week she got a C+, they took her out for ice cream because she tried her best. When I was valedictorian in high school, I gave my speech to a packed gymnasium. I kept looking toward the third row where they said they'd be. They showed up halfway through the closing remarks, carrying flowers meant for Rachel's dance recital across town. "Sorry, honey," Mom whispered afterward. "We misjudged traffic." But Rachel did so well. Grandma Nora was there, though. Always was. She stood in the back, holding a little camcorder she never really figured out how to use. Afterward, she handed me a notebook with tiny stars on the cover. "Write your victories down," she said, patting my hand. "Even the quiet ones. Someday, you'll need to remember you had them." That notebook lived in my backpack, then my nightstand, then the drawer under my bed. I filled it with moments I wanted to keep, things no one clapped for. My first solo essay published in the school paper, the day I helped clean up the church after a storm, the afternoon Rachel hugged me when her friend moved away. Not everything in it was an achievement. Some were just reminders that I mattered, if only to myself. By senior year, I had stopped hoping for applause. I focused on what I could control: grades, volunteer hours, college applications. I applied to 12 universities and was accepted to 9. Smith College sent a hand-signed letter and a small scholarship. I held it in my hands for 5 full minutes before I folded it back up and slid it into my notebook. My parents were too busy arguing over Rachel's prom dress to notice. I didn't tell them I got in. Not at first. I told Grandma instead, over tea in her tiny kitchen that always smelled like lemon and something older I couldn't name. She nodded slowly, then reached for a dusty envelope from a drawer I'd never seen her open. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said, pressing it into my hand. "Keep that with your notebook." I never opened it. Not then. I was afraid it might make me want something I couldn't have. The day I left for college, the house was unusually quiet. Rachel had a sleepover and my parents were running late. I sat on the porch with my suitcase, notebook on my lap. The cab driver kept checking the clock. When I finally climbed into the back seat, no one was there to wave. Halfway down the block, the driver slowed. Grandma Nora was standing at the corner wearing a windbreaker 2 sizes too big, holding a brown paper bag and a paper cup of coffee. "Figured you might need breakfast," she said, handing me the bag. Inside was a warm blueberry muffin and a note. "Go be someone you're proud of. Love, Grandma." She hugged me through the window, tight and quiet the way she always did. I clutched her hand until the cab started moving again. At 18, I boarded a bus to college. Grandma hugs me tighter than my parents ever did. My wedding felt more like a brand launch than a union. Rachel even asked for a bridal content reel. She said it with a sparkle in her eye and a phone already half raised, scanning my living room like a set designer. Imagine this angle with you in the dress, holding a latte in one hand and Tom's jacket in the other. So effortless, so modern. She snapped 3 photos before I could respond, then turned back to her phone, thumbs flying. Tom and I had gotten engaged in the most understated way possible, on a bench behind the library over paper cups of cider and wool mittens. He'd given me a ring with a small stone and a smaller price tag, and I'd said yes before he could get nervous. It was our moment, unfilmed and unposted. But the wedding, that had somehow become the Mitchell family showcase. Within a week of announcing our engagement, Mom had pulled out a planner the size of a dictionary. Classic garden ceremony, she murmured, flipping past pages labeled venue comparison matrix and preferred floral palettes. Dad had suggestions about which relatives should sit where, which photographers offered drone shots, and what kind of music would best reflect the Mitchell values. They didn't ask what I wanted, not really. And when I offered an opinion, it was usually met with a polite pause followed by a gentle override. The ivory dress is a bit safe, don't you think? Rachel asked one afternoon, holding up a blush-toned mermaid silhouette that I would have drowned in. This one photographs so much better. Trust me, I know lighting. Tom saw it all, of course. He didn't say much, but every time we met for late-night coffee at Evergreen Diner, he'd ask, "You sure you're okay?" I'd nod, then take another sip of bitter house brew and change the subject to table settings or guest lists. But the truth brewed under my collarbone, hot and slow. The day I discovered the missing money, it wasn't dramatic. No flashing alert, no red letters on a screen. I'd simply gone to the bank to transfer part of the wedding fund, money my grandfather had set aside for me years ago, something Grandma Nora had once whispered about during a Christmas Eve dishwashing session. "It's for you," she had said, dabbing her hands on a dish towel. "Your grandfather wanted you to have a cushion when the time came." That cushion, as it turned out, had vanished. The teller blinked at the screen, then tapped a few keys. "Looks like this account was accessed last month," she said, voice neutral. "The balance is currently 0. I stared at the number. I hadn't touched the account. I didn't even know it was active. "Accessed by who?" "I can't disclose that here," she replied, lowering her voice. "But perhaps someone with joint authorization?" The ride home was silent. Tom offered to drive, but I waved him off. I needed the air, the time. Each step echoed louder than the last. When I got home, Mom was arranging floral samples on the dining table, sunflowers and eucalyptus. I stood there holding my coat, throat dry. "Did you withdraw from Grandpa's account?" She didn't look up. "Hmm?" "The savings account, the one he left for me." Finally, she looked at me, blinking slowly. "Oh, that. Yes, we used some of it for the reception deposit. It's all in the family, sweetheart." I tried to breathe. "That money was left for me." She raised a brow, like I was being difficult. "You'll benefit from it. We're throwing you a beautiful wedding." I turned toward the kitchen where Dad was on the phone. I heard him say something about catering contracts. He saw me and gave a thumbs up. I wanted to scream. That night I called Sadie. She came over with a camera bag slung over her shoulder and 2 slices of pecan pie from the diner. "They didn't ask," I whispered, sitting on the porch steps beside her. "They just took." "Are you surprised?" she asked gently, offering me the fork. "Or just tired of pretending it doesn't hurt?" "Both." She rested her head on my shoulder. "You don't owe them a performance, just a life you can stand to live in." Later, she took a photo of me without asking, sitting on the porch, hair undone, pie in my lap. It was the most honest picture I'd seen of myself in years. In the days that followed, I went through the motions, dress fittings, seating charts. Rachel arrived at every appointment with 2 phones and a ring light. She filmed a behind-the-scenes reel of me trying on shoes, adding captions like "bride vibes" and "sis style guide." She tagged me in every story, and I untagged myself just as quickly. Tom noticed the shift. "We don't have to do this," he said one evening, as we walked past the barn that would be our reception venue. We can run away. Vegas, courthouse, back of the diner. I don't care. I smiled, but my heart felt folded in on itself. I care. I just don't know what's left of this day that's mine. He wrapped an arm around me. You're mine. Later that week, just before sunset, my phone buzzed. It was Grandma Nora. Her voice was calm, the way rivers are before they bend. Before the big day, come by. I've saved something for you. The envelope smelled like old cedar and tucked away truth. It rested in the center of Grandma Nora's kitchen table, beside a chipped mug of lukewarm tea and a folded paper napkin from the corner diner. Her hands, lined and careful, didn't tremble as she pushed it toward me. I sat on the edge of the floral seat cushion she'd sewn herself 20 years ago, heart thudding like I was back in 5th grade confessing I'd broken her birdhouse. I should have given this to you sooner, she said gently, but I waited until you were old enough to see it for what it is. I didn't open it right away. Something about the weight of the seal, the familiar scrawl of Leah in Grandpa Whitmore's blocky, deliberate handwriting, it made my throat close. I ran my fingers over the wax stamp. It had cracked slightly with time, like everything else he'd left behind. I thought he only left a will, I said. I didn't know he wrote letters. Grandma Nora nodded slowly, the sunlight catching the silver in her hair. He wrote just a few. This one he wrote the year before he passed. Your grandfather didn't say much in life, but when he wrote, it mattered. I opened the envelope as slowly as I dared, afraid it might crumble like dry leaves. The first line made my breath hitch. My dear Leah, I know I won't be around to see your wedding day, but if I've done anything right in this life, it's setting a few things in motion for when the world tries to take from you what you've more than earned. The letter wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. He wrote about the first time he took me to the train station when I was 10, how he watched me carry my own bag without complaint. He remembered the poetry reading I entered in 6th grade, the one where my parents left halfway through because Rachel felt faint from too much cotton candy. He mentioned how proud he was when I helped him replant the azaleas behind his workshop and didn't complain once about the worms. But then came the part that mattered most. I've made arrangements that your parents cannot change, though they may try. The account is yours, untouched until you are 28. If anything goes sideways, speak to Harold Halford. He has a copy of the original will and my written intentions. No one can erase what's been put down properly. My eyes filled before I could stop them. He had seen me all along, not the curated version, not the sister in the background, but me, fully and quietly. Grandma placed a hand over mine. Your father thinks control is love. Your mother mistakes quiet for agreement. Neither of them saw you, but he did. I sat with that for a long time. The clock ticked loudly above the stove, the one shaped like a rooster that had crowded every hour for 30 years. The air smelled of dust and cinnamon. Why didn't you say something sooner? I whispered. She sighed. Because I hoped they'd change, but now I think it's you who needs the truth more than they need grace. I folded the letter carefully, reverently, and tucked it into my coat pocket like it was made of glass. She reached beneath the table again and pulled out a small wooden box, the same one Grandpa used to keep receipts and old keys in. Inside was a notarized copy of the original will, with his signature still dark and bold at the bottom. He didn't want to leave things messy, Grandma said. He knew your father would try to manage things his way. That's why he named Halford as a second executor. I'd met Mr. Halford once, years ago. He had a gray mustache and always smelled like lemon balm. He'd been Grandpa's friend since they served together on the town council. I remembered him slipping me a caramel once during a boring legal meeting. I asked Grandma, do you think Dad actually believes he's doing the right thing? She was quiet a moment. I think he believes you owe him your life, and that includes your money. I didn't want to believe it, but I did. I thought of the way he talked over me during wedding planning, how he referred to my account as family funds. I thought of Mom calling it a gesture, like generosity should only flow in one direction. Grandma reached for a small envelope of her own with Mr. Halford's business card and a note. He's expecting your call. She smiled as she slid it toward me. Tell him Nora says hello and that it's finally time. I stood from the table slowly. The chair creaked beneath me like it didn't want to let go. Before I left, I turned back one last time and looked at the photo of Grandpa on the mantel. He was younger in the picture, standing by a lake, suspenders crooked and smile small, but certain. Thank you, I said quietly, not sure if I meant him or Grandma or both. On the walk home, the air was crisp and clean. Leaves danced in small circles at the curb, and I pulled my coat tighter, my fingers grazing the letter in my pocket like a compass needle finding true north. When I got inside, Tom was waiting on the couch, a book in his lap, unread. He looked up, reading my face like a question. You okay? He asked. I nodded. Better than I've been in a long time. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table, the letter beside me, Mr. Halford's card in my hand. I stared at it for a long time, letting the weight of everything settle. Then I reached for my phone, scrolled to Tom's contact, and hit call. He picked up on the second ring. I'm going to the wedding, but this time on my terms. I married the man I loved while watching the people who raised me toast themselves. Tom's hand was warm in mine, steady even as the wind picked up and rustled the white table linens beneath the barn's wooden beams. Hickory Falls had outdone itself with fall colors, golden leaves scattered like blessings across the lawn, flickering under the soft glow of paper lanterns. From a distance, it probably looked perfect, but standing at the altar, I couldn't shake the weight in my chest, not from nerves, not from the vows I'd written and rewritten. It was the strange, hollow feeling of watching a moment you dreamed of being packaged for someone else's satisfaction. Mom had chosen the flowers, ivory roses and eucalyptus, because they look expensive. Dad had arranged the guest list with the precision of a campaign strategist. Rachel had recorded the whole morning on her phone, including a segment of me brushing my teeth with a woke up glowing caption. At some point, it stopped being about Tom and me. It became about optics. Still, when I looked at him, I knew I hadn't made a mistake. His eyes never wandered, not even when the photographer called for a wide shot, and Rachel inserted herself into the frame like she was co-hosting the event. I do, I said, my voice clear, even in the chill October air. He squeezed my fingers before saying the same. I do. We kissed and the guests clapped, and the music started. Vivaldi, of course. Dad insisted on classical. Nothing too sentimental. During the cocktail hour, people mingled under strings of Edison bulbs, while servers passed around tiny crab cakes and sparkling cider and champagne flutes. I stood near the fire pit, watching Rachel pose with the flower girls in front of a rustic chalkboard sign that read, The Mitchell-Reyes Union. Sadie found me just as I was adjusting the hem of my dress near a pile of pumpkins. You look beautiful, she said, lifting her camera. Don't, I murmured. Not now. She lowered the lens. Okay, want to talk instead? I just want to feel like this day is mine, I admitted. You still can. That seemed impossible, surrounded by curated perfection. Inside the barn, the tables gleamed with hand-lettered place cards and centerpieces made of white gourds and brass lanterns. I hadn't picked a single one of them. I sat down next to Grandma Nora at table 7. She wore a navy blue cardigan over her floral dress and clutched her cane like it might walk off without her. You're glowing, she said with a wink. I smiled. It's the cider. You always did have your grandfather's way of pretending you weren't boiling underneath. I glanced around the room. Is that what I'm doing? She reached into her purse and pulled out a thin cream-colored envelope, older than the ones that came with RSVP cards. Maybe it's time to boil a little louder. I looked down at the envelope. What is this? Something he left for today. I thought about holding on to it, but then I saw your face during the vows. She took my hand gently. You're too young to feel that tired, Leah. The dinner began. Plates of meatloaf, sweet corn casserole, and roasted vegetables arrived, all served with wine that my father insisted pair well with Midwestern sensibilities. When Rachel gave her speech, part toast, part reality TV monologue, I sipped water and tried not to flinch. She's just being Rachel, Tom whispered. Doesn't mean it's about you, but it always was. Then came the part I dreaded, my father standing, glass in hand. He smiled, proud and polished. I'd like to say a few words. He launched into a well-rehearsed tribute, mostly to himself. From the moment Leah was born, I knew she'd carry our family values forward. He went on to mention her growth, our journey, the sacrifices we made to give her a foundation. Not once did he mention Tom. Not once did he mention the letters, or the decisions I'd made alone, or even the life I'd built without their help. My hands tightened under the table. My jaw aches from clenching. I felt Grandma's fingers brush mine under the cloth. I looked down at the envelope, still unopened. Dad raised his glass. To Leah and Tom, may you always reflect the family that made you. That was it. That was the moment I stood up. The music faded. My chair scraped against the floorboards. Everyone turned. I felt my dress tighter at the shoulders, the knot in my stomach unraveling with every step. I reached the microphone before I could second guess myself. Rachel blinked from her camera. Mom's fork hovered midair. Tom watched quietly, his expression unreadable, but open. I cleared my throat. This won't take long, I said. From the envelope, I pulled out a folded page. It was time. I could no longer let other people edit my story. I step up to the microphone, envelope in hand, her eyes scanning the room. This is my grandfather's final wedding gift to me. My grandfather loved quietly, but his words still speak louder than the applause you never gave me. The room went still, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. I hadn't planned the speech. I hadn't even opened the envelope until minutes before. But the words were no longer just Grandpa's. They were mine, waiting their whole life to come out. I unfolded the page, careful not to tremble. His handwriting, always sharp and measured, stretched across the parchment like a steady hand in a storm. I didn't read it aloud. Instead, I looked up and began to speak, not just to the guests, but to the little girl inside me who'd once clutched a cupcake by candlelight and waited for someone to notice. I was told this day would be about family, I said. But what I've come to realize is that family isn't defined by who organizes your guest list or who picks the flowers. It's who stands beside you when you have nothing to offer but your truth. I paused, breathing slowly. I spotted Sadie near the back, her camera lowered, eyes locked on mine. Grandma Nora sat with her hands folded, nodding once. Rachel froze near the sweetheart table, mid-scroll, her phone forgotten. My grandfather left me this letter not because he expected trouble, I continued, but because he knew trouble often dresses up as tradition. There was a murmur near the cake table, someone whispering, someone else shushing. I didn't let it break my rhythm. For years, I believed I had to earn love. I tried being quiet, being helpful, being invisible. I watched my sister shine. I watched my parents beam. I waited for it to be my turn. I turned toward my father. His face had hardened, his glass still midair. Mom reached for his arm, but he didn't move. I waited through missed birthdays, through forgotten performances, through awards that never made it to the fridge, and I told myself that maybe one day I'd be enough. A hush hung thick as old linen. But Grandpa saw me. He saw the girl who stayed late to help clean up. He saw the young woman who fought for a degree no one asked about. And he made sure I would have something no one could take. I reached into the envelope and pulled out a second page, the notarized copy of the will. This document confirms what my grandfather left me. It was meant for my future, for my foundation, not for photo ops or flower arrangements. Mom's hand flew to her mouth. Dad finally stood. That's enough, he said, his voice low but sharp. You've made your point. I turned to him calmly. No, Dad. You've made yours for years. This is the first time I get to speak mine. He opened his mouth again, but Grandma Nora rose slowly, her cane clicking once on the floorboards. Gregory, she said, her voice stronger than I'd heard in months. Sit down. It wasn't a request, and somehow he did. I faced the crowd once more. I didn't share this to embarrass anyone. I shared it because truth matters, and because love, the kind that's real, doesn't ask you to shrink to fit someone else's pride. Someone in the back clapped, then stopped. Then another joined. And slowly, without quite knowing why, the guests began to applaud. Not the polite kind I used to crave, but something softer, a sound that said, "We heard you." Rachel stepped forward, her voice uncertain. Leah, I didn't know. I held up a hand gently. It's okay. We'll talk. Just Not right now. She nodded, tears forming in the corners of her mascaraed eyes. I stepped away from the microphone, the letter folded once more and tucked into my dress like armor. My hands were shaking now, but it didn't feel like fear. It felt like a release. Mom remained seated, her eyes glossy. She didn't reach for me. She didn't need to. For once, I wasn't looking for her approval. I walked back to the edge of the dance floor, unsure what to do next. I could feel the pulse of 1,000 glances, wondering if I'd sit down, storm off, collapse. Then Tom stepped through the crowd, quiet as ever, like he'd just come in from the orchard. He smiled. "Still up for that dance?" I nodded slightly, tears falling, but lightly. 6 months later, Grandpa's letter sits framed on the wall above a shelf of used novels and fresh journals. It's the first thing people notice when they walk into the bookstore. Some stop to read it, others just tilt their heads, curious. The letter isn't flashy, just a single page, aged paper, behind glass, his neat handwriting still firm, but it holds a weight that anchors the entire room. When I unlock the door each morning, turn the sign to open, and switch on the little lamp near the typewriter, I glance up at it and feel grounded. Whitmore and Words wasn't part of any 5-year plan. Honestly, I didn't even mean to start a business. But after the wedding, after the speech and the silence, and the slow unraveling of old patterns, I found myself craving a place where stories mattered, where people spoke and were heard, where letters weren't forgotten in drawers or never written at all. The bookstore sits on the corner of Main and Chestnut, 2 blocks from the diner and 3 from the library. It used to be an old shoe repair shop. Tom helped me paint the walls a soft sage green, and Sadie donated a few of her photographs for the back wall, portraits of readers in quiet moments. I filled the shelves with donations, estate sale finds, and whatever I could rescue from my own overstuffed bookshelves. There's a nook by the front window with a mismatched armchair and a side table where I keep a rotating pot of tea and a stack of postcards. On Thursdays, we host letter night. It started as a whim. I put up a sign that read, "Bring a letter you never sent, or write one now." The first week, only 3 people came: Grandma Nora, a retired art teacher named Evelyn, and a high school student with a shy smile and ink-stained fingers. Evelyn read a letter to her late husband about the dog she finally adopted. The student wrote one to her future self. Grandma just listened, her eyes soft and far away. Now we average a dozen people, sometimes more. Rachel came last week. She slipped in quietly, no camera, no announcement, just her and a folded piece of paper. She waited until the end, then stood and read a letter to me. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't full of confessions, just simple words. "I'm sorry I didn't see you. I'm learning how." After, we hugged for the first time in a long while. Not a holiday hug, a real one. She's enrolled at the community college now, communications major, of course. She's thinking of transferring to a 4-year program next fall. She says seeing me take control gave her the push she needed. I didn't say anything at first. I just nodded and tried not to cry into my tea. Mom has been attending therapy. Slowly, carefully, she's reaching out. She came by the shop once, alone, and bought a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. She said it reminded her of being young, of wondering about people instead of judging them. She left a $5 bill in the tip jar and wrote "Proud of you" on the receipt. "Dad hasn't come by, that's okay." Tom helps out on weekends, shelving books and making terrible puns about titles. Sometimes he brings homemade cookies from the bakery down the street, handing them out like peace offerings. The kids love him. So do the older folks who linger in the armchairs and talk about how fast things move these days. One afternoon, I found Grandma dusting the front window display, humming something familiar. "I told your grandfather you'd do something like this," she said, smiling. "He always said you had quiet roots, the kind that hold steady in a storm." I think about that a lot, about roots, about the parts of us that grow even when no one's looking. I used to think I needed someone to water mine. Now I know I just needed space to stretch. This morning, a little girl came in with her grandfather. She found the basket labeled "Wall of Thanks" and pulled out a crayon-written note. "Thank you for having so many books. My mom doesn't yell when I read. She taped it to the corkboard herself, right below one from Evelyn and above a haiku by Tom. I picked it up, read it again, and smiled. Tom came around the corner, coffee in one hand, a pen in the other. "What's that?" he asked, peeking at the note. "A thank you," I said. "For you?" "For all of us." He leaned in, touched my hand. "Let's write one back, just because. There are moments in life when silence says more than applause ever could." What began as a quiet rebellion at my own wedding became a path to something larger, a place where unheard voices finally found space to speak. Kindness, I've learned, doesn't always arrive with a banner. It slips in gently, like a folded letter passed hand to hand, waiting to be read. When we stop judging what we don't yet understand, we make room for something deeper: connection. So maybe today's small gesture, an old book, a handwritten note, will become someone else's turning point tomorrow.